Hello and welcome back to Season 11 of the Equip Project. Jim, what do you make of our new intro music?
I like it. I think it's a little epic, perhaps. It's from Gladiator, isn't it?
It is. I think it is. I think it's very epic. It's an improved. Well, we love the hurdy-gurdy. We love the sort of medieval instrument known as the hurdy-gurdy, and it did a good job for us for a period. But we felt for this season, given the kind of gravity and weight of this topic, we needed something a little more epic.
Yeah, and it does play into the whole masculinity thing. I mean, I had suggested to you Thin Lizzy's The Boys Are Back in Town.
Some of the suggestions you sent through, Jim, I was really unsure whether you were serious or not, and I was too nervous to ask if you were joking.
I was joking, I have to say. No, so I like it. I think it'll be good.
Brilliant. Well, hopefully our listeners enjoy it too. We are working our way through a new series entitled Men of the West, and it's really about the rise of Christian nationalism. And in our first episode, we examined the theological roots of Christian nationalism. And you suggested that there are two theological ideas that lie at the root of the movement: Reformed political theology, and a view of the end times known as post-millennialism.
That's right. We briefly discussed another root of Christian nationalism, which comes from the charismatic movement. It's known as the Seven Mountains Mandate, and it's particularly associated with the New Apostolic Reformation movement. So men like David Barton or Greg Locke come from that theological stable. So does Paula White, you may have heard of. She is close to President Trump and Pamela Bondi. But when we go looking for the intellectual foundation for Christian nationalism, we find it in the Reformed political theology of the 17th and 18th centuries, and also in this thing called postmillennialism.
Okay, because maybe our listeners are sort of thinking, well, when I've heard about Christian nationalism, when I've seen it appear on my social media feeds, it seems to be more focused in the political arena. So people in the MAGA movement, perhaps, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Mike Johnson, Pete Hegseth, Lauren Boebert, these sorts of individuals, maybe we think of them as Christian nationalists, but they don't ever seem to mention Reformed theology or postmillennialism. They seem to just make a simpler case. And maybe that's the Christian nationalism our listeners are more familiar with. They want a nation with laws that are derived from the moral framework provided by Christianity. And they argue that the separation of church and state has actually been weaponized by secularists to privatize Christianity, and that move should be resisted because the Christian moral vision for a society is much better than the mess the left has made of the West. So perhaps some people listening to episode 1 might feel the political discourse about Christian nationalism seems a bit distant from the theology we talked about in our first episode.
Yeah, I think that's an entirely fair pushback. So let's take a few minutes to make the link between what you might call the old theological ideas and contemporary political discourse. So I'm going to make 2 points. And the first is that the big argument over Christian nationalism isn't really over its vision for society. It's about how we get there. It's about method. So if Christian nationalism reduces to the vision of a society with laws derived from Christian morals, most of us would be on board with at least a diluted version of that vision. You know, we certainly wouldn't want to tear down mosques, but we would very much like the laws of the land to protect the sanctity of life and marriage. So if that's Christian nationalism, sign me up immediately. The bigger problem is not with the vision, it's with how we get there. At the heart of Christian nationalism is the fusion of religion and politics. Okay, it's about the use of political power to force non-Christians to behave like Christians. To use biblical imagery, the Christian nationalist says, yes, it takes the Spirit of God to turn a goat into a sheep, but I will use my political sword to make the goats behave like sheep. So that's my first point. If you're trying to decide whether or not you're a Christian nationalist, don't worry so much about the vision for society. Ask yourself how you will realize that vision. My second point is historical. You mentioned Pete Hegseth just now. He is closely linked to Doug Wilson, who we mentioned last week. But other MAGA figures like Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, Mike Johnson come from the wider Christian right, which have been heavily influenced by an ideology called Christian Reconstructionism. So is Ted Cruz. Now, Christian Reconstructionism was founded by a scholar called John Rushdoony in the last part of the 20th century. Rushdoony was a Reformed theologian and a postmillennialist. Now, his ideas were extreme, but they have shaped a lot of thinking on the Christian right. I don't even remember the Tea Party. Yeah, that's a good example of his influence. Now, these ideas spread across multiple denominations in the US, the Southern Baptists, Charismatics, and even Catholics. So I am not saying that Christian nationalism is confined to Reform circles. That's obviously not the case. My point is that the intellectual foundations for Christian nationalism are built from the two theological ideas that emerged in 17th and 18th century Reformed circles. Now, I probably still haven't convinced you of the link from theology to politics. So why don't we walk through the theological summary we arrived at last week, and I'll make the link to politics for each one.
Brilliant. So last week we described the theology of Christian nationalism as a set of 5 points. The first one was that Christian nationalism rejects the exile model, caricaturing it as a form of quietism.
Yes, the exile model is based on the words Jeremiah wrote to the people of Judah, who had been carted off into exile in Babylon. He told them to settle down, build families, and accept that they must live in a pluralistic pagan society. Now, the Apostle Peter uses the exile language when he writes to the churches in Galatia and Cappadocia and other parts of Asia Minor. Christian nationalists sneer at those of us who adopt this model, accusing us of retreating to our little churches, pulling up the drawbridge, and awaiting the return of Christ. But that is not a fair thing to say. Exiles are still called to stand for truth. Of course, Christians should provide a prophetic voice into society. We should do everything to establish a Christian moral framework for society. We're called to be salt and light. But the Christian nationalist builds his worldview on the Reformed political idea that political power should be used to enforce Christian morality.
As you said earlier, the key question isn't so much about the vision for a society, it's about the methods we use to achieve that vision. The second point, theological point, you made was that a Christian nation should be built top-down, with harsh punishments for idolaters. That idea linked to our third point, which was that liberal democracy should be replaced with authoritarian rule by a Christian prince.
Yes. These theological ideas of a top-down authoritarian governance structure might seem remote to us now. I can hear some listeners who are sympathetic to Christian nationalist vision say, well, no one wants to go that far. No one is thinking of replacing democracy. But just reflect on the past few years. The desire for a great man, a heroic figure who will tear down our enemies and restore justice, is a frighteningly seductive idea. And I think it lies behind the massive support for Donald Trump among evangelicals. There is no doubt that politics has become more authoritarian in recent times. Just ask the Danish Prime Minister. The Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made a speech a couple of days ago in which he argued that we're moving back to a time when great imperial powers tear up the rules-based approach to international affairs that existed for the past 50 years. So if you think that John Calvin's view of the Christian prince is a piece of irrelevant historical rubble, just look at how MAGA supporters view Trump. There is a theological root to that phenomenon. And I'm going to argue in this season that the authoritarianism that lies at the heart of Christian nationalism makes it uniquely vulnerable to the rise of dictatorship and totalitarianism. So the big question about Donald Trump's legacy is unrelated to his policies. I think it's the concern that he may have normalised authoritarian leadership and may inadvertently have paved the way, sometime in the future, for a genuine antichrist figure.
Our fourth summary point was about the rise of ethno-nationalism. Christian nationalists like Stephen Wolfe see the US as a home for white people with a European heritage. And that idea rightly troubles us, but as we'll see in episode 3, the rise of uncontrolled immigration has caused ethno-nationalism to raise its head once again.
So that leaves us with our final theological root. I argued last week that Christian nationalists promote an eschatology that sees no future for the nation of Israel. And that view, I suggest, removes an important barrier against anti-Semitism.
You made the point last week that most of the theologians who support Christian nationalism are post-millennialists. They believe that the church will establish the peace and stability of the millennial kingdom before Christ returns. And because they believe the church replaces Israel, they see no future for Israel as a nation, and they don't see any significance in a piece of land on the coast of the Mediterranean.
I gave a simplistic overview of end times models last week. I think I described a simple two-way split between postmillennialism and premillennialism. There's actually a third option called amillennialism. Just so people are up to speed, let me quickly explain how those models work. I'll start with the position which I hold, which is premillennialism. I don't think that the church is going to establish Christian nations across the globe so that Christ will return to a world that's stable and peaceful. In fact, I think things are going to go very wrong at the end. The Antichrist will arise and a terrible tribulation will start. But just when all looks lost, Christ will return to establish his millennial kingdom. So the pre in premillennial refers to Christ coming before the millennium starts. Okay. Now, postmillennialism, as we saw last week, takes the opposite view, as you just described it. But then there's this thing called amillennialism, and it spiritualizes the concept of the millennium. Amillennialists say that the millennium is taking place now up in heaven. So if you like, the millennium becomes a symbolic thing, not a future period of time here on earth. Now, for our purposes, when it comes to the question of Israel's future, there's no difference between postmillennialism and amillennialism, because both are based on the Reformed idea that the church replaces Israel, and so neither model sees any future for the nation of Israel.
These discussions about eschatology get really complicated, don't they, Jim?
Yes. I actually sit quite loose to the various doctrines of end times. But maybe the main reason why I hold to premillennialism is that it provides a theological barrier to the rise of anti-Semitism. It is a straightforward historical fact that the Christian church's greatest sin over the past 1600 years has been anti-Semitism. The idea that the Jewish people were Christ killers who have been permanently cut off from the purposes of God has been used for centuries as an excuse for anti-Semitism. Martin Luther asked, "What shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews?" He made 7 proposals. Out of decency, I will only repeat the first 2. First, he said, set fire to their synagogues or schools. This is to be done in honour of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. And secondly, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed.
Wow. That's pretty bleak. In Romans 11, the Apostle Paul challenges the idea that the Jewish people were permanently cut off from God's purposes. The chapter begins, I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. And then he goes on in verse 11 to say, again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring?
Yeah, I don't know how anyone can read Romans 11 and still hold to the idea that the nation of Israel has no future in God's plan for this world. Anyway, Ollie, I hope I've done enough to persuade you that the current political discourse in the West can be traced back to the theological roots we discussed last week.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's been really helpful and hopefully has brought our listeners on a bit of a journey from what they see on their Instagram feeds through to what we're talking about in this series. Okay, let's leave theology for a moment and dive into the world of politics. A book written by a Christian historian called Alec Ryan has just been published. It's called The Age of Hitler. Anyone who picks up the book would automatically assume that the book would cover the rise and fall of the Third Reich, from the rise of Adolf Hitler in 1933 to his death by suicide in a bunker in Berlin in 1945. But that's not actually what the book's about, is it?
No. Alec Ryan's thesis is that we are living now in the age of Hitler. In fact, we have been living in the age of Hitler for the past 80 years. To explain what he meant, we need to think for a moment about just how horrible the first half of the 20th century was.
Yeah, the first half of the 20th century is often described as a century of genocide, an era of unprecedented catastrophe which saw the collapse of established orders, total war, and industrial-scale mass murder. It was a period where industrial progress was harnessed for destruction, resulting in estimated fatalities in the hundreds of millions. The First World War led to roughly 16 million deaths. It destroyed 4 major empires and caused immense trauma to the lost generation. Then only 2 decades later came World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, resulting in 70 to 85 million fatalities. It featured total war, over 50 million civilian deaths, widespread bombing of cities, and the first use of atomic weapons. But towering over all that horror is the worst of them all, the thing called the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the Nazi regime's systematic industrial murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in extermination camps.
The French novelist Laurent Binet calls the Second World War our Trojan War, a landmark, a reference, a source of inexhaustible stories, a collection of epics and tragedies. Nazis come as readily to our minds and to our lips as Satan did to medieval Christians. Fascism has become the definition of absolute radical evil. And I can prove this thesis to you very easily. A cross can be treated as an ordinary thing in culture today. But what about a swastika, which packs an emotional punch like no other visual image? Or think about the cancellation of Kanye West. Say anything positive about Hitler, and you've broken really the only taboo left in culture. Or think about people who deny the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is our modern equivalent of blasphemy. These are words that deny the deepest moral truth our society is built on, and everyone knows it. Now, those observations bring us back to Alec Ryan's book. Even today, he says, we live in the age of Hitler because for the past 80 years, Hitler, not Jesus, defines absolute morality.
That's a really shocking idea. What does he mean by that?
Well, let me illustrate it like this. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, very famous. It was written in 1948, immediately after the Second World War. It sets out human rights like freedom of speech and religion, freedom from want or fear. And it sets those human rights out as universal principles. Okay? Before the Enlightenment, those precious universal principles would have been derived from Christianity. Human beings of value because we are made in the image of God. But now listen to how the UN Declaration argued for human rights as a universal principle. It says this: we hold these rights to be self-evident because disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. You see, human rights in a secular world have always been a castle in the air. They're held up as universal principles, but principles that rest on nothing. So the UN Declaration defines them by contrasting them with their negation. Hitler becomes the opposite pole to human rights. We define goodness using the negative.
So rather than defining our most basic shared values using the ethics of Jesus Christ, the West decided to define them by using Hitler as their negative counterpart. Christianity had been a store of values, but it was made redundant by secularism. So now, says Ryan, we have this dark lord who we use to define moral value and to establish our collective moral compass.
Yes, but think about what that means. It means that we now know what we hate, but we do not know what we love. Or rather, the things that we do love, human rights and liberty, are quite deliberately, if you like, vacant categories. Their whole point is that they are undefined spaces in which individuals can find for themselves what they love. So we have a pretty impoverished understanding of what philosophers used to call the common good.
When Alex Ryan says that we all live in the age of Hitler, he means that we live in a world that defines evil as fascism and sees goodness as the absence of fascism. Therefore, every big decision made in the West, every new possibility, was to be measured against the shared commitment of never again.
That's absolutely right. A phrase that will crop up many times in this season is the phrase, the post-war consensus. And the post-war consensus is best defined in the phrase you have just used, never again. We look back at the Third Reich, shudder in horror at the flattened cities, the countless dead, the wreckage of societies ravaged by war, the cruelty that bled into insanity, and we say, never again. So we need a completely new type of society, one that drives away all the strong gods that drove the West into madness in the first half of the 20th century.
According to this post-war consensus then, what does this new society look like? What are its main characteristics?
Okay, I'm going to suggest there are three features. The first is to create a soft society. The post-war consensus was a project that regarded whatever is strong loves and strong truths, as a source of oppression. And I think our listeners can now begin to see why these political developments are linked to the crisis over masculinity. Everything that was strong was regarded as a return of fascism and the Third Reich. So society had to become soft and weak. Weakness was a deliberate strategy, weakening the bonds and affinities that could generate strong convictions or passionate loyalties. Any talk of those qualities was immediately likened to goose-stepping SS officers. But how was this softness to be achieved? Well, by using the key weapon called inclusivity. Inclusion became the god who softened differences. Transgression was prized for breaking down boundaries, opening things up. So everything from sexual diversity to multiculturalism was designed to weaken the hard, authoritative centre of culture. Okay, so that was the first thing, to create a soft society. The second feature was what's called openness. George Bush Sr. Addressed the United Nations in 1989, just at the end of communism. And he said, "I see a world of open borders, open trade, and most importantly, open minds." So openness here means dissolution. It means disintegration and deconsolidation, if you like. Society is deliberately atomized into a collection of individuals who can go and find their own meaning. The philosopher Karl Popper wrote a hugely influential book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Civilization, says Popper, faces a choice. We can either live in a tribal or closed society characterized by deference to authority, or we can break free and build an open society. And in an open society, only the individual matters. So that was the second feature. We've had softness and openness. The third feature is what I'm going to call cynicism or skepticism. Every individual was to be educated to be suspicious of everything an authority figure ever said. Harvard's 2007 report on educational theory said, "The aim of a liberal education is to unsettle presumptions, to defamiliarize the familiar, to reveal what's going on underneath and behind appearances, to disorient young people." So young people were educated to become cynics, to interpret every truth claim, every action taken by an institution as a power play. Instead of dogmatic convictions and passionate loyalties, society needed a spirit of critical questioning.
So these three features, softness, openness, and cynicism, were deliberate social policies adopted after the Second World War in order for society to become soft, open, and cynical. Some really important aspects of traditional societies had to be torn down. We've called this episode The Retreat of the Strong Gods. In a moment, we'll go through 4 of these strong gods that the post-war consensus has worked so hard to remove. But before we do that, Jim, tell us what is meant by the term strong gods.
Well, I'm using the term God, obviously, in a very loose sense. I mean an idea or a principle that is of ultimate value to you, something you might be prepared to die for. Strong gods are capable of producing convictions and passionate loyalty, a shared love that binds us together and brings solidarity. So here's my point. My point is that the project to create a soft, open and cynical society had to demolish a whole set of ideas and values that are opposed to the post-war consensus. The architects of that vision would see the strong gods as the dark forces that produced such dogmatism and passion among the Nazis. But I'm going to argue that the strong gods, which the post-war consensus seeks to demolish, are in fact good and wholesome things. We were meant to love them.
The first of our 4 strong gods is the thing called virtue. We might call it the desire to be a man of noble character, someone who loves the good and lives to develop a character that is virtuous.
Our society has demolished that god because it sees convictions about right and wrong, or objective good and evil, as an act of domination. Not long after Karl Popper published his book, the psychologists got to work on the concept of openness. And they invented the idea of an authoritarian personality. Okay, this was a key idea in the 60s and 70s, the authoritarian personality. And so they went looking for potential fascists. And the potential fascist, they concluded, was an American who was raised in a hierarchical family with black and white rules. His outlook on the world was characterized by conventionality and rigidity. He engaged in right versus wrong thinking that supported traditional gender roles and moral values. You see, in the open society, all overly repressive norms should be eradicated, along with a middle-class culture that disapproved of the unconventional. Open societies were encouraged to loosen up, to step around dominant social norms. And in a world like that, a man who desired to be virtuous was just a middle-class stooge with an authoritarian personality type.
The second strong god is the concept of solidarity. The virtue of solidarity, the sense of fraternity and common destiny among all members of a society. It's based on shared convictions and loyalties, which are consolidating and unifying rather than diversifying.
Yes, the open society was to be atomized. It was to consist of a set of individuals, and the individual was king. Now, the problem with an atomized, decentered society is that there can never be solidarity. There is no longer a we in the sentence, we are British. nor can there be any sense of transcendent purpose. I don't think there is a more basic masculine virtue than the desire to stand shoulder to shoulder in the defence of something bigger, something that has transcendent value. Men love to be part of something bigger than themselves. We love to work, to stand, to fight together for a cause that is bigger than any of us. But in the open society, nothing is bigger than the individual and his needs. A shared sense of transcendent purpose is a phrase that causes the progressive left, once again, to hear the sound of goose-stepping SS officers. Now, there's one particular form of solidarity that was regarded with particular distaste. I'm talking about national solidarity. The concept of patriotism is almost universally seen as dangerous and potentially fascist today. The idea that a nation might be anything more than a technical administration was dangerous, said Popper. In fact, the recognition of anything higher than the individual, he said, would always tend towards totalitarianism. And so the old idea that a nation is a home to its citizens has been jettisoned. Globalization allows transnational supply chains to develop, resulting in a harmonious social order without the totalitarian temptation of state-sponsored planning. And then there's mass immigration. Mass immigration is a deliberate strategy designed to reduce the concept of a nation to the technical management of a territory. We need mass immigration to counter the fascist ideas of blood and soil, apparently.
The third strong god is family. The concept of the nuclear family, in which a husband and wife raise their biological children in the security of a stable and loving home, is a powerful idea. It has been the basis of every successful society in the last 10,000 years. But the open society deliberately deconstructed the nuclear family. The architects of the new open society pictured post-war men and women increasingly uncomfortable inside the starched collar of culture. Soon enough, the constricting collar was taken off. By the late 60s and early 70s, Popper's open society had evolved to include open marriages, sex outside of marriage, and the normalization of homosexuality.
And the final strong god is truth. In the open society, even the notion of a truth claim becomes a threat to personal autonomy. Truth becomes the midwife to totalitarianism. So the old idea of standing for truth is gone. Instead of truth, we are offered a chance to create our own meaning in life.
So the post-war consensus caused the strong gods of virtue, solidarity, family, and truth to retreat. And in their place, the weak gods of softness, openness, and cynicism ruled. In the age of Hitler, the cry of never again has banished the strong gods, and the policies of the left have become the destination point of the post-war consensus.
Now, if we were only discussing politics, we could end there. But we've called this season The Men of the West because we're analysing two intertwined crises, the crisis of masculinity and the crisis over the demise of the West. And I think it's obvious now how these two crises are coupled together in this episode. The strong gods that have retreated are precisely the goals that are most important to men. To be a man of noble virtue, to stand shoulder to shoulder with other men in defence of something that has transcendent value, to build and protect a family, to stand courageously for truth. But now men find themselves in a feminized society, a culture based on empathy and consensus building, a society that runs using the tactics of mean girls. And whenever a man steps towards the strong gods, he is immediately labelled as a crypto-fascist. The policies of the progressive left have not only wrecked Western society, they have built a culture in which men can no longer act as men.
The open society rewards everything which the strong gods reject. The call for openness shifts moral prestige away from the centre and towards the periphery. Those who transgress and break down boundaries are seen as exemplary citizens. They promote an open society. They serve the common good by weakening norms. It appears that those who foreground diversity, innovation, and transgression deserve to rule rather than the men who love virtue, solidarity, family, and truth. That is what the post-war consensus has trained us to believe.
So, the post-war consensus, for all its good intentions, has destroyed Western society. We are made for love. We do not want to rest in our solitary selves or in our atomized little worlds. We desire to live shoulder to shoulder with our fellow man in the service of shared loves. So no, we're not safer when our natural kinship relationships are deconstructed, or when patriotism is seen as an evil. The cynical reduction of truth claims to power plays does not make our society more humane and hospitable. In fact, its destruction of all our anchoring convictions about truth and moral virtues makes us anti-human in the end. The only problems that the post-war consensus can see are those of things like discrimination, exclusion, and conformism. And those things are just nails for their open society hammer. But meanwhile, the actual problems we face, atomization, the dissolving of communal bonds, disintegrating family ties, and a nihilistic culture of limitless self-definition, go unaddressed.
There is perhaps a final irony in this story, Jim. The whole point of the post-war consensus was to drive out authoritarianism and totalitarianism from Western societies, and yet the left has become obviously authoritarian. For example, the use of hate speech legislation to constrain free speech, or the way in which careers can be ruined when someone gets cancelled, or think of the encroaching of the state into family life and church life. The progressive left maintains it exists to root out fascism, yet it is in danger of becoming as authoritarian as the regime it regards as pure evil.
I think that's true. I want to close by going back to Alec Ryan's idea that we're living in the age of Hitler. Instead of defining the good in the light of Jesus Christ, we have spent 80 years defining evil by the darkness of the Third Reich. So provided that we avoid fascism, we are being good. But that negative definition will never build a sustainable society. The Bible tells us to love our neighbours, but in the age of Hitler, all we can say is tolerate your neighbour. Tolerance is a negative, shriveled little virtue. And that's just one example of the principle that the progressive left has no vision of the common good. And so there is no defence against totalitarianism. In fact, the defender against fascism becomes the fascist.
Thanks, Jim. Lots to mull over there, and I'm sure it will raise plenty of questions for our Equip listeners. If you do have questions, please do reach out to us on the Equip Project Instagram or email us at theequipproject@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Join us again next week for Blood and Soil, where we'll be examining the impact of globalization and discussing how uncontrolled immigration has given rise to the ugly thing called ethno-nationalism.